Further, Mr. Bailey relies extensively on the Ninth Circuit's holding in Quan versus Arch Wireless. But the Ninth Circuit does not differ at all from the other circuit holdings in regards to employer policies. In Quan, the court stated that there was no formal policy governing the city-issued pagers. The only policy there was an informal policy that the police lieutenant had told to employees regarding, if you pay for your overages, I will not audit your device. So the Ninth Circuit correctly held that Mr. Quan could reasonably rely upon that informal policy because it was the only policy that was in place, and he had not acknowledged any other policy.
And that doesn't apply here because there's a formal policy.
There is a formal policy in place, and that absolutely does not apply to this case because the formal policy was what Senator Romero was following.
So do operational realities ever make a difference at all if there's a formal policy? Are you wanting us to say no?
When there is legitimate regulation in the form of an informal policy, that is the operational reality of the workplace.
But if there's a formal policy, does that make any difference then? That's my question.
If there's a formal policy, it does make a difference to what the operational reality of the workplace is. If there is a formal policy, then it is the operational reality of the workplace.
The formal policy is?
The formal policy is, Your Honor.
And so even if they don't comply with that policy, it really doesn't matter.
It does matter that employees comply with that formal policy because it's the operational reality of the workplace. It's the policy that is governing an employee's use of the BlackBerry. And Senator Romero had no authority to establish any other policy. He was specifically appointed according to the formal policy, and his actions indicated that he was indeed following the formal policy despite what he was telling employees at the time. Further, even if Mr. Bailey
his authority is to conduct the audit. Doesn't that imply a certain amount of discretion in how he conducts the audit? And if he has that discretion, can he not then set ground rules for audits?
Senator Romero was specifically appointed according to the informal policy to
the
formal policy, excuse me, Your Honor, the formal policy to enforce the formal policy. Senator Romero had no authority, not written in the formal policy or given to him by anybody else, to exercise any sort of discretion in establishing any sort of informal policy. Even if Mr. Bailey has a reasonable expectation of privacy, the legislature's audit of the contents of his BlackBerry was nevertheless justified under the circumstances. In O'Connor, the United States Supreme Court stated that an employer search is justified when it is for a non-investigatory, work-related purpose or upon suspicion of work-related misconduct. Here, the legislature had a non-investigatory, work-related purpose in conducting an audit of Mr. Bailey's text messages because it was conducting a cost-benefit analysis. First of all, the legislature's authority to conduct a cost-benefit analysis is specifically written into its Code of Official Conduct. The code states that the IT Committee conducts cost-benefit analyses at the request of the Legislative Budget and Finance Committee. This is exactly what occurred here. The Budget and Finance Committee asked Senator Romero, the appointed official from the IT Committee, to conduct an audit of BlackBerry devices for purposes of a cost-benefit analysis. The legislature again explicitly codified its interest in maintaining an efficient workplace. The legislature paid for the overages of its employees, and it is therefore reasonable that the legislature would have an interest in making sure that the overages it was paying for were work-related and not personal. Accessing the contents of Mr. Bailey's text messages in order to determine whether he was costing the legislature money due to work-related or personal communications is a non-investigatory work-related purpose. Further, the legislature's audit of Mr. Bailey's text messages was for an identical non-investigatory work-related purpose as that in Quan. In Quan, the Ninth Circuit affirmed the city's audit of Mr. Quan's text messages as non-investigatory and work-related because the city wanted to determine the efficacy of the current text message character limit. Here, the legislature was doing the exact same thing. It was wanting to determine the efficacy of the current text message limit. The legislature was therefore...
I guess it's hard still to understand why they have to read the non-state text messages in order to fulfill that purpose.
Because the formal policy prohibits personal use, and the legislature needs to make sure that the overages it is paying for are work-related overages. However, that does not mean
Sure, but so I have 100 text messages, and I say, yeah, these were all mine. These 30 were mine. These were personal. But these other 70 are work, and here, read those 70. And you can read them and confirm that they're work-related, state business. And I'm telling you the other 30 aren't. And I guess I have to live with the consequences of that if you ever enforce your policy, right? Why isn't that good enough?
Your Honor, I see that I am out of time. May I finish answering?
Mm-hmm.
It is not good enough because the legislature needs to have an accurate determination of the amount of characters that are being used on a monthly basis. Mr. Bailey had incurred overages more than twice in the past 3 years.
Yeah, okay, but so I look at the ones that the employee identifies as state work, and I can count those characters, right?
Yes, Your Honor.
And I know the total number of characters, right?
No, Your Honor, because there's no way to tell what the total number of characters are unless you're looking at all of the messages.
How do they figure overages? What difference does it make how many characters it is then, if you don't know the total?
The legislature, however, would know the total in looking at Mr. Bailey's text messages, both personal, work-related, all personal. However, the legislature needed to look at all of those messages, the entire spectrum of them, to be able to count the characters and determine how far over the character limit he was, and whether increasing that character limit would help the legislature cut costs.
There's not a statement that says how many characters he uses in a given time?
No, Your Honor, there's a monthly communications history that gives the to from information.
How do they figure out what the overage is? How does some cell phone, how does BlackBerry figure out what your overage is?
Well,
Do they know how many characters were used?
A cell phone company would figure out the amount of overages because those messages and the number of characters would be entered into their computer system as a person was using the device.
Okay, so why can't they ask BlackBerry or Verizon, whoever they use, how many characters were used totally? And then we can find out how many were used for state purposes. I'm having a hard time understanding why that's not good enough, counsel.
The legislature could not ask the cell phone company because it was an invasion of Mr. Bailey's expectation of privacy. Just because those messages are being sent to the cell phone company does not mean that the cell phone company, under the Electronic Stored Communications Act, has the authority to then disclose the contents of those messages to somebody else.
I'm sorry for taking you over time here, counsel.
Respondent respectfully requests this court to affirm the district court's denial of Mr. Bailey's motions to suppress.
Thank you, counsel. Counsel?